It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Bernard Jenkin, Shadow International Trade Secretary Emily Thornberry, former Home Secretary Jackie Smith, and historian and Daily Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley. Today,
this pay rise will make a real difference to people's lives.
Is nothing short of insulting to our 500,000 nursing members.
Should the NHS get a bigger pay rise? Can the Northern Ireland Protocol be rewritten?
I don't think that there's anything unusual or surprising in looking again at a treaty.
Should we hold politicians to promises made before the pandemic?
A tax lock on any increases in VAT or income tax.
And MPs don't have to wear masks, but should they? Let's take another look at those scenes from the Chamber in the House of Commons during Prime Minister's questions yesterday. You can see some MPs, including Jacob Rees-Mogg, their Leader of the House, not wearing a mask. But the guidance from the Speaker there, Lindsay Hoyle, is that MPs are strongly advised to do so in the Chamber, as it is a crowded indoor space in the Palace of Westminster. So my question to start with, Bernard and Emily, is should MPs be wearing masks in the Chamber? Bernard?
Well, it is now a discretionary matter. It's for an individual MP. Personally, if I'm not speaking, I will wear a mask. I think we should respect the chair, that the chair is, the Speaker has made clear his view that he would prefer people to wear masks, but the discretion has been given back to members, and we should respect members who feel that they don't want to.
Emily?
I think that MPs should wear masks. I think that people should be wearing masks in closed spaces. I think that if you think about what a mask is for, it's not actually there to protect you, it's to protect other people. That's what the science says. And so if you care about other people, you should be wearing a mask. And on our side, we do.
Right. Well, Tim, this is a decision a lot of people are going to have to make, not just MPs, but in their everyday lives when people are in and out of shops, for example. What do you think?
None of this makes any sense. It's totally contradictory. We seem to be entering a period of government by loophole, whereby the government says you're advised to do this, but technically you don't have to. Take the NHS app. You don't have to download it. All this pinging that's going on, you just don't have to actually download it. People think they have to. They don't actually have to. And I have a friend who, whenever he's out shopping, he takes a look at the notice on the shop window, and if it says our customers are encouraged to wear masks, he thinks, right, well, I'll go in there because I'm encouraged to, but I'm not told I have to. So as far as he's concerned, I've been encouraged. Thank you for your encouragement. I've chosen not to do it. And MPs are doing exactly the same. So that's the contradiction here. We've been told it's advisable, you're encouraged, you don't have to do it. It's absurd.
Right, well, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, just to mention, is now self-isolating after being pinged following PMQs. Jackie, you used to be in the House, you aren't anymore. Would you wear a mask if you were there?
Yes, I absolutely would. It's a strange conception of freedom, isn't it, that my freedom impinges so seriously on other people's. I mean, if I was in the House of Commons, I'd be thinking about the thousands of workers who are supporting MPs to do their job. And when I travelled on the train yesterday, or I was in the hospital where I work, I wore a mask to protect others. I never subscribed to the idea that Monday was Freedom Day. And as I say, if my freedom prevents others from actually being able to get out and about, it's not a freedom worth having in my book.
Bernard?
Can I just say, if that is the case...
well, hang on, Tim's
wear a mask. If that's the case, if the situation is that serious, and if you should be encouraged to do it, and if it's morally your burden, you should do it, why is it not a legal obligation?
Jackie?
Well, that's a very fair point, Tim. And, you know, one I think that the opposition has made pretty strongly. The government, I mean, where I agree with you is that the government's advice is all over the shop, whether or not it's about wearing masks or whether or not it's about what you should do if you're pinged. Actually, communication has been one of the shortcomings of the government throughout the whole of this pandemic, and never has that been more obvious than in the last few weeks.
Bernard, you're not in the government, but do you agree with what Jackie's saying?
Some of it. I mean, I biked here to the studio. I wore a helmet. The government advises you to wear a crash helmet if you're wearing a bicycle, or like riding a bicycle. But it's not compulsory. So there are lots of examples of that. I would wear a mask in the House of Commons if it was crowded. If I would find myself sitting in acres of space without anybody around me, I might not wear a mask. I mean, if you're going to be on a train, should you be prosecuted for not wearing a mask when the rest of the carriage is completely empty? I think we need to hand back responsibility to people. And do you know what? This is a great sort of Westminster Village row going on about this and blaming the government for the lack of communication.
Is it a Westminster
row? The vast majority,
row?
can I just make this point? The vast majority of people in this country want to be given responsibility and are going to take those responsibilities seriously. And why don't we respect people for that? That's one of the differences between the two main political parties, by the way.
Right.
We tend to trust people's judgment.
If there's 1 in 10 person who decides to behave irresponsibly and they have COVID and the rest of us catch it, then how is that right? It's not right. It should be that we should be protecting one another, and frankly, it should be the law that we protect one another. It's not the same as having a bicycle helmet. It's the same as driving down the street at 70 miles an hour. It's not looking after other people.
This is not as black and white as all this, you know.
Well, it is,
actually.
It's about protecting others, and during a pandemic, that's what we should be doing.
So
I see on the other side of the chamber these Tory MPs exercising their so-called freedom to infect me with COVID, I think, quite frankly, who are these people? They're supposed to be representatives of the nation.
Well, that's quite a claim. But go on, Bernard.
Grown-up fashion than that.
Let him respond. Yeah.
Every year, hundreds of thousands of people die from winter flu. But we don't make it against the law to go to work if you've got flu. We rely on people's common sense. And we are transitioning from an emergency to a society that's got to learn to live with coronavirus. And we cannot do that by acres and acres of compulsion on people's individual actions, because, in fact, what we're beginning to see is a refusal of people to comply with that compulsion.
Right. I mean,
so it's got to be done by consent. And, Emily, if you can't persuade people to do the responsible thing, what's wrong with the arguments you're using? That's what you need to ask.
All right, let me go back to Jackie and Tim. Jackie, I know you've been trying to come in, but do you agree it's a transition, that it's time to let people make some individual choices?
No, of course I agree it's a transition, but it's disingenuous to suggest that this is only about personal responsibility, because in effect, given the very muddled messages that the government is giving out, the responsibility will actually be sitting with the shop workers, with the ticket inspectors, with the people whose organisations may well have said that mask wearing should continue, but where the government has backed off taking responsibility for supporting them in doing the safe thing for themselves and everybody else. So it's not only about personal responsibility, it's actually a shifting of responsibility from a government who wanted to be able to proclaim that they were delivering Freedom Day, but are now rapidly backing off it because they understand the implications of that for the continued growth in the numbers of people who've still got COVID.
Tim?
A Prime Minister who's so desperate to be popular with the nation that he doesn't dare say something that will make him unpopular.
All right, we'll let Tim respond.
I would like Sir Bernard to be correct and for this to be about personal responsibility, but I don't think it is, because what the government has done is pass the buck onto the private sector or on to, say, transport companies to say, you make your own minds up and you enforce this. And the consequence is that the private citizen doesn't quite know what their rights are. If I sit on a train and I don't wear a mask, why can't I not wear a mask? What is the company going to do to me? Who has the authority in that situation? Who's going to prosecute me? Why will I have to pay a fine? None of this makes any sense. That's the point. Either the emergency is ongoing,
yes.
in which case Emily is correct, and it's outrageous that people aren't wearing masks and it should be law if the emergency is still ongoing, or the emergency is over, in which case it truly is a matter of personal responsibility, and there should be one consistent approach, which is it's entirely up to you, and no one can fine you, you can't get in trouble if you choose not to wear a mask.
All right, to wear or not to wear a mask is clearly going to be the question of the summer. We're going to move on.
I don't think so. Most people get on with their lives.
Well, and that may be true too. The front page of the Daily
People
Mirror.
can't get on with their lives if you don't wear a mask.
we're going to...
precisely the point.
Jackie, we're going to talk about something else because otherwise we won't get through the programme, unfortunately. And it is the last one of this summer until September. So, pay insult to NHS heroes on the front page of the Daily Mirror. Is that really all they are worth? Now, this is because the government has accepted a recommendation from the pay review body of a 3% pay rise for most NHS staff, backdated to April 2021. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, you heard him in the headlines, I should say, announced that the rise will mean an additional £1,000 a year for the average nurse. Bernard, you will remember that the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, last year said he wanted to see NHS staff properly rewarded. Is 3% properly rewarding them?
Well, we all want to see the nurses properly rewarded, but we all recognise that the government has got to make ends meet, and we're borrowing massive amounts of money at the moment because of the COVID pandemic. Despite that, the government is honouring the pay review body recommendation. It represents a real terms increase, which is more than many in the public sector will get this time round. And it represents a real terms increase over what the 2 or 3 years ago an all-union agreement with the government agreed was an acceptable pay rise. So it's progress towards higher pay for nurses, but we were never going to get there in one leap, and I don't think even the opposition has been campaigning for a more substantial pay increase.
Well, let's ask. I mean, we're going to show this graphic, which shows the current inflation rate at 2.5% as of June. So it is a real terms increase. It is the recommendation that's been accepted, as usual. Do you accept it?
I think there's still some debate about that, because although you've got 2.5, I have a stat of 2.4. I think it's going up quite rapidly, and the question will be whether the 3% will be above inflation or won't be above inflation, and I think that is kind of the debate at the moment.
Right, but of course Keir Starmer said a pay rise should be at least 2.1% when this debate was being had before the pay review body.
Yeah.
So, in fact, that would be less than inflation.
Well, except that inflation is going up. That's the point. You know, what our view is that we have to, of course, recognise the important contribution that nurses have made, the fact that our health service is absolutely exhausted. We need to be doing more than simply clapping them. Warm words is not going to put food on the table. We must have a proper pay rise.
Right. And what does that look like, Emily? Because the Royal College of Nursing has called for 12.5%. Is that what Labour would do?
So what the debate at the moment, and I think that they're consulting their membership at the moment, and we want to see what comes out as we hear from nurses as to what their view about this is. But the first question is, well, first of all, the first question is, how on earth did we end up with 1% at the beginning of the day and 3% by the end of the day?
Well,
and
that was the proposal from the government, and they've accepted the pay review body.
But it had taken the day for them to come out. And then the next question was how it was going to be paid for. And then the next question is this above or below inflation? And then we want to know what the health service has to say about it.
I'll come back to you about what you think the pay rise should be if Labour were in power. But it is true, isn't it, Bernard? You know, the clap for carers every week, thanking staff for their heroic efforts on the front line of the fight against the pandemic, and not prepared to put any more money where your mouth is.
Well, I just think we need to be a little bit realistic. I don't remember any government paying more than a recommendation by a pay review body. And the recommendation of the pay review body has been honoured. And actually, I have to commend Emily and the Labour Party on this. They have not been hugely irresponsible and sort of galloped off with the Royal College of Nursing. It's perfectly legitimate for the Royal College of Nursing to point out what has happened to nurses' pay over this period or that period in making their case. But we arrive at a settlement, and no responsible political party can write blank cheques. And incidentally, the one point I'd really question is we've never given pay rises on anticipated rates of inflation. We only give pay rises on historic rates of inflation. And let's hope the inflation rate doesn't go up as much as some people fear. But if it does, of course, that'll be reflected in subsequent pay increases.
But I think that also what the Royal College of Nurses is saying is that they've had periods where their pay has been frozen. And so it really depends, when do you begin the period from? Do you begin the period from the last time that there was actually live potential that their salary was going to go up? Do we take it from that baseline? Do we take it from another baseline? And inflation is going up. And there's the additional point, which is, you know, we have money, we have £40 billion nearly, you know, money to pay for test and trace. And yet we don't seem to have a tenth of that amount, you know, available to be able to pay nurses a decent amount.
So how much more should they be paid? What would you like to see the pay rise be?
I say, at the moment, we've only just heard that this is what the pay review has said. We need to be finding working out what the unions say about it once they have consulted their members. But the principle remains that we must make sure that our gratitude and our concern about this, our gratitude to nurses and our concern about the state of the NHS at the moment is properly reflected in the current circumstances, which are exceptional.
All right. What we do know, Jackie, is that the Labour government in Wales has accepted the 3% offer. The Scottish government offered NHS staff a 4% pay rise, which the unions have rejected. So, in your mind, what is the acceptable level?
Well, first of all, I mean, I chair a very large NHS trust, and I have to say the government's suggestion that 1% pay increase would be appropriate.
That was never a serious offer. We know that.
Absolutely.
Well,
it was never a serious offer, Bernard. It was the government's evidence to the pay review body. In my day, we took pretty seriously the evidence that we gave to pay review bodies. So if you're telling me that this government doesn't, well, that's something that perhaps they should look at. But anyway, that was their evidence to the pay review body. The pay review body, I think, helpfully has come up with a higher suggestion. The fact that the government is now claiming somehow credit for that is a little bizarre, but anyway, it's better than the 1%. But the other question, of course, that needs to be answered, for a trust like mine, a 3% pay increase, welcome though it is, higher than the 1%, would cost us £34 million. I think it's money worth spending, but it is not money that we have so far been allocated by the government. So the question is, will the government be fully funding this pay increase so that NHS trusts are not going to have to start making incredibly difficult decisions about choosing between services and the number of staff and whether or not we pay them anywhere near a decent pay increase.
All right, we'll come back to that issue in just a moment. But first of all, Tim, in terms of how we should treat various people in various industries and walks of life when it comes to pay rises, the country did come out and clap for carers and many people putting up signs in support of the NHS staff and what they've done. Should they be treated differently? Are they in a special category compared to perhaps teachers who are also on the front line, or supermarket workers or bin men and women? What do you think?
I don't think it's a case of them being regarded as being in a separate category. It's more that there was greater appreciation for them because people at that moment realised how much they owed them, that one particular group. So I don't think it's a case of ranking one worker above another. And you're quite right to list other people who have, frankly, at the height of the pandemic, effectively risked their lives to do their jobs, which includes things like working in supermarkets, whole areas of work that are low paid and which don't get any kind of political attention, and because they're in the private sector aren't a matter for public sector pay bargaining, they took risks too in order to deliver a service. So I don't think it's a question of one service being ranked over another. The fundamental economic problem is that as a consequence of the amount of money spent over the last 18 months, there has to be some sort of austerity in government finance. The problem is that normally you would do that through a public sector pay freeze. That's just one very easy tool to use. A harsh tool on those who work in the public sector, but a straightforward one for the Treasury. The problem is that when you go through a pandemic like we've been through, it is the public sector workers who have made the greatest contribution in many people's minds. So you'll effectively be squeezing the very people who people feel have made one of the greatest sacrifices. So that's the conundrum. And it's interesting listening to that subject to hear Labour not jumping on a populist bandwagon on this, because they know too that to sell themselves to the electorate, they have to show that they understand the financial situation the country's in, and they have to make judicious decisions about spending as well. So I don't see a race to the top on this politically, because why would there be? Both parties know what the financial situation is and know what Britain can and cannot afford.
Jackie?
Well, I think it's right that Labour does need to demonstrate that it understands the challenges that will be faced by public finances and that they would face if they were in government. But that's just to come back to my previous point, why the government also needs to show that it understands the difficult decisions that will need to be made in NHS bodies throughout the country, who welcome the fact that the proposal is for a higher pay award than was originally proposed by government, but who nevertheless will need to deal with the consequences of that in terms of the numbers of people that they can employ and the services that they can offer. And at the moment in the NHS, we don't even know what finance we're going to be getting for the second half of this financial year. So it's actually pretty difficult to plan financially at a time when, of course, there's also an enormous amount of work going on to recover the backlog of treatment that understandably has built up during the course of the pandemic. So responsible government is not just about announcing a pay award, it's also about how you're going to fund it for those who will be delivering it to the workers who, I agree, deserve it.
Right, and as I say, we're going to talk a little bit more about funding, future funding, in a moment. But first of all, the Northern Ireland Protocol. The front page here of the Daily Express. Think again, EU. You must change course over deal. This is about the post-Brexit trading arrangements between GB and Northern Ireland and the movement of goods and the number of checks that take place. The EU has rejected UK proposals to rewrite, as they say, the Northern Ireland Protocol, that arrangement. And the EU has said solutions had to be found within the existing framework. Bernard, you obviously agree that the EU needs to come on board and have to make it work, but this is your deal. You signed it.
Well, so did the EU. And the EU should be now recognising that the protocol in its own terms is not achieving what it's meant to achieve. It was meant to achieve stability and sustaining the Good Friday Agreement and protecting the peace process, but actually it's undermining the peace process. And the protocol itself that you say I signed provides for measures to be taken if there is serious economic, societal or environmental difficulties that are liable to persist, or diversion of trade. There is definitely diversion of trade. There is no doubt about it, and there are societal difficulties. So what the government has done has put forward some proposals to address these problems in order to support the peace process in Northern Ireland, in order to secure the Good Friday Agreement, in order to secure the confidence of both communities in Northern Ireland. And I thought the Labour Party, in the debate I held last week, was very responsibly recognising the concerns of the unionist community in Northern Ireland about this. And I would commend the Labour Party for supporting the government in trying to get a veterinary deal with the EU based on the New Zealand experience, which is about mutual recognition, not about the application of EU standards, which we would have to accept without any say over them.
I mean, Emily,
that's the way we are, sort of thing we're proposing in this white paper.
Yeah.
And it's a very responsible position.
I mean, the bit that Bernard read from the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's true, isn't it, that they have to sort of minimise the impact of the deal on everyday lives, that there is a commitment to limit the disruption to supply chains, and unionist communities say they are feeling disrupted by it. But that is fair.
Not just unionist communities, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Not just unionist communities. The farmers, the fishermen, the people working.
But they are
in
one
shops,
of the community.
I mean, everybody is disrupted by it. It doesn't work, and it doesn't work in the way that it was promised it was going to. And I think that, it's all very well for Lord Frost to say, we weren't to anticipate how this was going to work out. You do wonder what they were doing then. It is their deal. The Prime Minister signed off on it. Every comma, every dot. The Prime Minister put his name to it, and it's all part of getting Brexit
Let's
done.
talk about
I
the
have
future,
this plan.
shall we,
It can be sorted out. Well, let's just make that point first. That was the promise. Right? It's not working. So, yes, what we need to do, of course, is to have a form of veterinary agreement. So what we do is that we have an agreement with the European Union that our food meets the same standard as their food. Now, it seems to me that for 40, 50 years we were in the European Union, we had the same standards. And when we left the European Union, the Brexiteers told us that what they wanted to do was to build on those standards. So we were never going to go below European standards. We were going to have better food. We were going to have better farming standards. Right. So in those circumstances, I don't understand why we don't have a veterinary agreement with the European Union in which we say, our sausages are at the same standard as your sausages. There's no reason why we can't simply have... And that's what the European Union has said. That's what the unionist community have said. That's what all the political parties have said. That's what everyone said. The only people saying no is this government. And and let me just make this final point. The question is, why?
Bernard?
Why do they not want to sign up to standards that we have had for 40, 50 years and we want to improve on? And the reason Lord Frost has let the cat out of the bag, let me just finish. Lord Frost let the cat out of the bag when he said that we were going to sign up to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and that therefore we would not be able to have those veterinary standards for very much longer.
All right,
in other words,
listen, you've made various...
to lower the food standards.
All right, you've made various allegations,
You're
Bernard.
a much more fun person when you're off the air.
Well, and I'm just saying, this is my gig.
Let him answer, Emily.
The reason is, what the EU wants us to do is to accept their standards in perpetuity, dynamic alignment. They want us to subject our standards to the scrutiny of the European Court of Justice, because that's your policy. You want us to start rejoining the single market, because that's what this involves.
What do you want to change?
But actually, your spokesman in the House of Commons last week said that that the Labour wanted a veterinary agreement like New Zealand, which is based on just recognising that each other's standards are as good as
we can have equivalence. We can have whatever it is. But we need to have something. At the moment, we've got a government simply saying no.
But you want the government to agree
something that works.
Hang on. You want the government to agree that we should be subject to the European Court of Justice all over again. If you don't want that, then you support the government's position.
If there will be European law left in Northern Ireland as part of the protocol, then the European Union has said for the application of European law that we need to have the European Court of Justice implement it.
But do you
that
agree?
Really is a little bit of a red.
Well, hang on. Let me put one question. Hang on, Emily. One question to you. One question, Emily. Hang on.
Do you want to draw?
All right, you said that. But the one question that Bernard is putting you is: do you want to be aligned to EU standards and customs regulations in order to get the free trade that you talk about without checks?
It was always going to be the real, for me, the real problem was always going to be Northern Ireland, which is why the first time I did Prime Minister's Questions, I raised the customs union and Northern Ireland at that point. There is a problem, and frankly, if we don't have a veterinary agreement, we're not even off the starting blocks.
Right.
It takes two to tango. When the EU,
I'm not saying the EU.
When the EU signed the Northern Ireland Protocol with us, we were making the assumption that they would sign a free trade agreement like they've signed with many other countries that would have mutual recognition of product standards in the same as other countries. But they won't do it. Now, the only question is now, can we both agree that the Northern Ireland Protocol is not working? If we agree it's not working, do we support the EU, who supports that sticks to the Macron doctrine? Nothing is negotiable, nothing is renegotiable, everything's got to be implemented. Or do we sit down and try and work something out? So we're inviting the EU to come to the negotiations.
Well, and at that point, I'm going to interject and let the others in just a moment. We've heard a lot of Dominic Cummings from his interview with the BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg. He's the former chief advisor to Boris Johnson. But let's hear a little bit where he explains the thinking behind, at the time when this deal was signed.
Fundamentally, what happened is that the Irish decided that they wanted to fudge things and punt a bunch of questions post the deal, and that suited us as well. So it suited both sides to sign up to something that was not what either side really wanted, and which punted difficult questions into the future to figure out later. That suited them and it suited us.
So, Tim, do you think that's a rather honest assessment of what happened?
That's exactly what happened, yes. The problem was politically that Britain was stuck, negotiations were stuck, and the British negotiating team's hands were tied by the parliamentary majority. This is back in the dark days of Theresa May and early Boris Johnson. And the only way to break that deadlock was to agree to a fudge on Northern Ireland. Now, at that point, there was a divergence in philosophies, which for many of us leavers is precisely why we voted to leave the EU. The EU's view was, you've agreed to this, so presumably you're going to adhere to it. You're going to stick by the letter of what it is we've agreed to. The British view was, you can tell this is a fudge, so I presume we're going to find some way either to reform it and tinker with it in the future, or ignore it and get around it. That was the divergent philosophical point of view. The European, all about the letter of the law. The British one, far more pragmatic, far more about free trade. And that's why we're stuck. Because the EU's very sense of integrity comes from the writing of rules, the upholding of rules, the adherence to rules. Britain is trying to do something different. So I think this can only be reformed by dramatically rewriting the protocol and rethinking it.
Jackie, do you agree with that?
No, I don't. And first of all, I think if there's anybody that doesn't need international trade regulation mansplained to them, it's probably Emily Thornberry. Secondly, I don't think it's wrong for us to hold the government to account for making a treaty which very, very quickly after they've made it.
I'll come to you in a moment. Go on, Jackie.
Secondly, I don't think it's wrong to hold the government to account for having to, in their arguments, rewrite a treaty very quickly after they've made it. I think it's appropriate to scrutinise the claims that they made at the time and the fact that clearly it hasn't worked in the way in which they promised it would. But I think Emily makes the key point here. Surely If, as we were promised, it is not the intention to lower standards, then it should be possible to make the sort of agreements that Emily has outlined. And if it isn't, then that suggests that perhaps we were being lied to and that there always was an intention to lower our regulatory and food standards, and that that's essentially what the government is trying to protect and wants to renegotiate to enable them to do.
Right, Tim, you're shaking your head.
I think it's about it's about potentially having different standards, and it's about the potential to diverge, and it's about the principle of the sovereign control over your decision to do that. I don't think it's about a race to the bottom whatsoever. I don't think that was ever the intention. No one wants to do that. It's about whether or not you want in perpetuity to be tied to decision-making in Europe. And there was no point leaving if we were then going to sign up to lots of little treaties along the way that effectively meant we were still tied to Europe, its decision-making and its judicial process. That would have made a nonsense of Brexit.
Jackie?
Well, I understand that that was the objective, but as we can clearly see, it's failed because, and I thought Dominic Cummings was probably appropriately frank about the fudge that the government, and to be fair, I suspect as well the EU got itself into in order to get over that final hurdle to enable us to Brexit. These were always problems that people identified as being possibly coming, and they've unfortunately been shown to be right. There is a second broader point here that I think Jenny Chapman was making in the House of Lords yesterday, and that is we do need to be careful as a country who now wants to take its place in the world as part of global Britain, that we don't get a reputation for wanting to constantly rewrite and go against treaties that we've signed only a few months ago. That is bad for our credibility and our role in the world.
Right, yes, Bernard, what do you want to say to that? Because she did say that, Jenny Chapman, yesterday. Is there anything less British than forging an agreement, never having any intention of making it work?
Well, I think we have tried to make it work, and we're still trying to make it work. We're trying to negotiate within the framework of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And let me just remind you what Article 13.8 says.
You go ahead.
About the protocol. That is the article which talks about the protocol being superseded by any subsequent agreement. So this was only ever intended to be a temporary transitionary agreement, and it's now being treated as though it's the tablets of stone being brought down from Mount Sinai.
Right, well, can I just also ask then on that, do you think the conditions have been met to justify the government triggering what's called Article 16? In other words,
there's no question about that. That's absolutely cut and dry, but the government doesn't want to do that.
Right.
The government has absolutely deliberately said we're not doing that, we're inviting the European Union to come and have a negotiation instead.
I understand that.
I think what's happening is that the government's saying they're not going to trigger Article 16, i.e. walk away. The European Union has said we're not going to take Britain to court. So we're just going to end up with this mess continuing and continuing. And I heard on the radio just yesterday, I think it was, the chief executive of Marks and Spencer's, you could almost hear his hair being pulled out because they have invested a great deal in Northern Ireland and they want to be able to continue to trade in Northern. They are a trusted trader, for heaven's sake. Why aren't they able to export properly? And what he says,
they won't agree to it.
Yeah, but do you think that is
let me
the
just
EU?
finish my sentence, which is, to hear him say, that one of his lorries was turned back because a form had been filled in dark blue ink instead of black, shows that, there's a certain amount of bad behaviour on both sides.
Is that intransigence then on the EU side?
Of course there is. Of course there's bad behaviour on both sides. And what we need to be able to do is to get both sides to the table. But there needs to be a certain amount of goodwill. And frankly, there is not goodwill when you hear some of the things that Lord Frost says.
All right, we're going to move on. We've got a little bit of agreement there at the end,
yes,
I think.
We'll get there. We will get there.
OK. Well, on that note of optimism, after the summer, just to let you know, Politics Live will be taking a look at how the government is doing on keeping its manifesto pledges, if you can remember them all. We can see the front of their 2019 manifesto here, signed by Boris Johnson. I will not be going through. It's entitled My Guarantee. But first, we thought we'd discuss how the pandemic may have changed the promises that the parties have made. Bernard, we're almost 18 months into this pandemic. It's the biggest political, health, economic crisis of our lifetimes. Are the circumstances now so different that it is time to tear up that guarantee, that 2019 manifesto, and start again?
Well, I'm afraid we've already had to compromise some manifesto promises because of the acute situation. I mean, Emily will no doubt remind us of the fact that we've come off 0.7% of a gross national product for overseas aid.
Right. And will the public understand that or not?
I think the public are quite mixed about that. It depends how you ask the questions about it. If it's about inoculating children and educating women and saving infants' lives, then the public are very much in favour of overseas aid. If they see money being transferred to corrupt regimes around the world and being squandered, then they don't like aid. But I mean, I think
that would be
that's
the case with or without a pandemic, wouldn't it?
That is, yes, but you see, I think I think it was a very difficult decision, one particularly I wasn't particularly happy about, but I supported as a temporary expedient. But I mean, I hope we don't have to tear up a lot of our manifesto promises. But it's a fact of life, isn't it? Lots of politicians make lots of promises at election time, and it's also true that, sadly, Emily, for us, a lot of our promises are not believed anyway. But that's not a reason to break them.
Yes, go on, finish your sentence.
Well, I think the overriding obligation is to secure the economic future and security of this country.
Well, and of course that will be debatable, but broadly speaking, on the approach, Emily,
and we've got to get borrowing back under control.
Okay.
In the long term.
Should politicians be levelling with voters that the pandemic may mean that your pledges, promises will have to change, or not?
I think there are times when that's right, and I think that if you explain to the public, I think they're perfectly reasonable. But I think there's a lot of the biggest ones are not ones that I don't think the government can hide behind the pandemic. I think getting Brexit done, which was you don't have to think about this anymore. We can get it sorted out. You can see they haven't got Brexit done. That was number one promise. I think number two was actually social care. We have a plan. I have a plan. It's ready. It's about to go. They have a majority of 80. They have, they could be, if they wanted to, a government that could take a leadership role on this major issue that has not been solved for more than a decade. That's what they could do. And then, of course, it isn't just 0.7, but it's also they promised they weren't going to cut the army.
Right. Let's just come back to the issue of social care, because I'm just going to show everybody this headline in The Times. Rise in national insurance to pay for Tory social care reforms. Now, we have been expecting, Bernard, this announcement on social care. It's been delayed now until after the summer. But following on from that headline, if they were to raise the government national insurance, that would be breaking a manifesto pledge, wouldn't it? We heard it in the headlines. You have got to fund it in some way. Would you be prepared to break that pledge, not to raise any of the headline taxes in order to pay for social care?
The idea is that we're not raising the headline rates, we're getting employers to pay too. But I suspect this will go hand in hand with another change, which is, of course, we've got the triple lock on the pensions.
Yeah.
And, but we've got a very artificial, odd situation right now. We're going to probably have sort of 7 or 8% growth in the economy this year. So that would mean that the pensioners get a 7 or 8% increase.
And is that justifiable?
They won't be paying any of the national insurance contributions.
So is that justifiable?
Well, I think that is a case where the promise was made on certain parameters, and the parameters are now so completely different. I don't think the Labour Party is going to campaign to the ends of the earth to give the pensioners an 8% pension increase, because it can't be justified.
Right.
And so that that could be another promise that technically we break, but in its spirit we will honour, because of course the pensioners will carry on getting above inflation increases.
Is that how Labour will see it? You wanted the government to stick to what's called the triple lock on pensions.
I think that it was a clear promise, the triple lock. I think
so. You give them an 8% increase.
Any anomalies can be ironed out, I think, but I think that the principle has to stand that we have a triple lock. That's what the government said they were going to.
So you would still go for the highest, whatever is highest, whether it's inflation, wages.
If there are anomalies, then I think that we need to level with the public. But I think that the principle remains the same, which is the government stood on a triple lock. That's what they should. That's what they should be delivering.
All right,
that's what they should be delivering.
And what about on social care? Increasing national insurance to pay for that?
What we've said is that we will look at any proposals that the government puts forward. But overnight we haven't just heard that they're going to put up national insurance to pay for social care. We've also heard, haven't we, this briefing that, we were going to do social care, but now we're having to pay the nurses more. We won't be able to afford to pay for nurses. I mean, really? This is what they're putting round? I mean, it's nonsense. So we will wait until we actually see what the proposals are, and we'll look at them carefully. I remember going into Number 10 more than 10 years ago as the shadow social care minister to sit down with the government to try and sort this out. out.
Yeah, I mean,
We
it's been
still
going on for
haven't
so long.
got anywhere.
I'll have retired by the time it is sorted out. Tim, just and Jackie, broadly on the principles, though, of sticking to pledges and promises that have been made, because it gives an indication of the sort of government or the sort of opposition that you are going to be, whether or not something like a pandemic has actually happened. Tim, what will voters think?
I think they'll understand this is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and it changes everything, and it'd be unreasonable to expect governments or oppositions to stick to exactly what they wrote. This is the time in which governments and oppositions will be judged on things like character, experience, and crucially, philosophy.
Yes.
We know that economic policy is going to be different in the next couple of years. The interesting question is, what will distinguish a Starmer and a Johnson approach? Will a Johnson approach put reviving the free market first, ending lockdown swiftly first? Will Starmer be slightly different? That's when philosophy gives you a guide, a mast to lead you in a certain direction, even if the actual substance of the policies has to change.
I think that's right, and I think that the point is with Keir is that he has put forward the principles under which he wishes to be able to make decisions when we hope the government, the people will give us the opportunity to serve. And what we're saying is that we have a particular approach, and of course we can't be saying at this stage exactly what we would do when in government, because unfortunately even the best will in the world, we're not going to be in government for a couple of years. In the meantime, we hold the government to account on its character, on whether or not it is credible, and whether they are telling lies to the public, whether they're able to give out proper messages, whether they are consistent, and whether they're showing real leadership. And we say they're falling down on all of those fronts. Right.
So, I mean, Jackie, would you be happy to see the manifesto pledges by both parties sort of dropped, really, and rewritten? I mean, one of the key ones of Keir Starmer's, as you'll remember, when he became leader, was to increase income tax for the top 5% of earners and reverse cuts in corporation tax. Now, he's been asked about this more recently, I think a few months ago, and he said now is not the time for tax rises. So in a way, is he softening the ground for a future announcement to say, actually, that pledge won't hold?
Well, first of all, I agree with what others have said, that I think the British people will understand a discussion following the enormous social and economic upheaval of the pandemic about where our priorities should be as a country. But I think they will also judge all politicians on the choices that they make about those priorities going forward. And we've already talked about the choice of the government to cut money for the most vulnerable people in the world. At the same time, of course, as they're throwing around bonkers suggestions about royal yachts, etc. We've already talked about the choice between whether or not you're going to pay, pitting against each other, health service workers, and the absolute desperate need for social care reform. But they'll also want the government to be competent. And even on some central pledges, like levelling up, for example, what we saw last week was the Prime Minister not even taking seriously a significant promise that he's made to the country, to those people who voted Tory in parts of the country that really need levelling up, to make this a reality and to bring forward proper policies.
OK, Bernard, we haven't got that much longer, but do you want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think we're all in agreement, actually, that we're in an exceptional situation, and we're all going to have to cut the cloth to fit the circumstances that we're in. And within that, I thought Emily gave a very good account of what oppositions have to do. And some of it is successful, some of it is less successful from the opposition's point of view. The government's got to make these judgments, and the government will be judged, as Jackie says, on the choices it makes. I don't think we can do much better than that.
All right.
That's the way it works. And
you've got to leave me some room to say goodbye, Bernard, to everybody for the summer. Listen, thank you to all of my guests. It's been a great programme to finish off with this session. We'll be back in early September from all of us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.